So with the Fantastic Four movie having come out recently, I've seen a lot of questions from people who were asking, how powerful is Franklin Richards really? And this really comes in a lot of debates. People who think that Franklin Richards is as powerful or more powerful than the Phoenix Force, things like that. So we're going to clarify all of this and clear up all this stuff. And we're actually going to use 3 stories to do it. We're going to talk about Daydreamers, Heroes Reborn, and Future Foundation issue number 23 to clarify all of this. But before we do, something that I want to specify here is the difference between a universe and a dimension or a pocket universe, because those are not the same thing. So a universe in Marvel Comics is just a space within the multiverse that houses stars and galaxies, solar systems, and other dimensions. But in effect, it's like rooms inside of a house, the house itself being the universe. Having said that, just because it's a room in your house does not mean that the laws of physics apply. So if we use Asgard as an example, right? Asgard as a dimension is much smaller than the overall size of the main Marvel universe, Earth 616. It's like a guest closet in your house, maybe even the master closet in your house. But the dark dimension is totally different. The dark dimension is like the tent from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. If you guys remember that scene where they go into the tent and the inside of the tent is bigger than the tent itself, that's how the dark dimension works. So it'd be like opening the closet in your master bedroom, and that closet is bigger than your entire house. I know it sounds crazy, but in fact, the dark dimension is really that big. Now, there is a reason behind that. It goes by different names, the Splinter Realms, the Archipelago of Anguish, so on and so forth. But the fact is, at the end of the day, it is still considered part of the main Marvel universe. And that's where a lot of people get tripped up. The reason why is because in Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme, issue number 21, there was a backup feature in that story called Tales of the Dark Dimension, where Doctor Strange goes through and starts explaining the history of the Dark Dimension, giving a few more details than what we had already known. And that's where Marvel just started using the phrase dimension and universe interchangeably. And in fact, in that story, the Dark Dimension is basically referred to as being its own separate universe, completely removed from the main Marvel universe itself. And it actually went that way for quite some time. It was not until Ultimatum issue number 4 where we saw Doctor Strange in the original Ultimate Universe killed by that reality's version of Dormammu, who came from that reality's version of the Dark Dimension. So that's when Marvel established there is a Dark Dimension within every universe. And so with that in mind, again, it's important to take away from this explanation that a pocket universe is not the same thing as a main universe itself. Pocket universe, dimension, these are interchangeable terms. Pocket universe and universe are not interchangeable terms. And so the reason why this matters is because while Franklin Richards has done all kinds of crazy cool things in his time in Marvel Comics, he's aged himself into an adult, albeit subconsciously. He's resurrected Galactus from the dead. That's one of the most well-known moments of his character's history. Heroes Reborn is actually the first story that I want to talk about here with regards to what Franklin Richards is really capable of. Because in Heroes Reborn, this was a story that came in the aftermath of the Onslaught saga, the great big huge event that hardcore comic book fans already know about. But in effect, pretty much all the superheroes outside of the X-Men and Spider-Man died fighting this just incredibly powerful guy named Onslaught. He was a combination of Xavier's frustration with humanity and Magneto's hatred for humanity merging together into a single psychic entity. When all those superheroes had died, Franklin Richards resurrected them all from the dead and put them in a dimension within the main Marvel universe called Dimension F. It also goes by the name Counter-Earth. But they had a whole history there, different origin stories, different lives, the whole 9 yards. Now, eventually, all that gets undone. Franklin takes them out of Dimension F and brings them back into the main Marvel universe itself. But it's important to understand here, this was a pocket reality. It was a dimension within the main Marvel universe itself. Now, this is visited yet again in a story called Daydreamers, issues 1 through 3. Now, it was a mini-series, and the cool thing about Daydreamers is that what Franklin Richards ends up doing is actually creating a pocket multiverse within the main Marvel universe. Specifically, he creates what's called the Nexus of Realities. Now, the Nexus of Realities is a thing that does actually exist. A lot of you guys are aware of the Man-Thing. In the Florida Everglades, there is a portal to the nexus of realities. And that's what the Man-Thing guards. And for those poor souls who go and try to invade the portal or enter into the nexus, once the Man-Thing encounters them, if they feel fear, they burn at the Man-Thing's touch. So as you can imagine, very few people ever actually succeed in passing the Man-Thing's test and entering into the nexus. What Franklin did is he created an almost perfect duplicate of the nexus of realities. And that allowed him to jump through all these different dimensions. Now, going through this nexus was not a full replica of the multiverse. It was only a handful of different dimensions, but it was still an incredible display of power because it demonstrated the fact that Franklin Richards was able to copy locations he had never actually been to before. And so for reasons that were never explained within the context of that story and that we still don't even really have a great explanation to, Franklin Richards seemed to have a pretty strong understanding of the form and function of the multiverse long before any of the events from Secret Wars 2015 when he had explored the multiverse in any meaningful way, which is kind of bonkers when you sit down and think about it. But then you go into Future Foundation issue number 23. Now, this was part of Jonathan Hickman's run on the Fantastic Four. Specifically, Future Foundation initially started out as basically a kind of relaunch of the Fantastic Four title, and then Future Foundation and Fantastic Four started jumping back and forth through titles as Hickman started going through and continuing his story. There comes a point in Hickman's Fantastic Four when Franklin Richards from the future as an adult comes to the present day and wakes up the powers of his younger self, which had long since been dormant after Reed Richards had put mental blocks in place. What matters here is that adult Franklin Richards taught younger Franklin how to harness his powers. And so by Future Foundation issue number 23, Franklin now has full control over his abilities. But what his older self teaches him is how to harness them and how to use them responsibly. And so in this particular comic, there's a point where adult Franklin Richards, younger Franklin Richards, and his best friend Leech, a mutant with the ability to shut down powers, they enter into this pocket universe. And when that happens, they create all kinds of things. They create planets, they create stars, they create life, all kinds of life. They operate as superheroes. They do all kinds of nuts stuff. But everything that happens in this pocket universe is strictly due to Franklin's ability to create using his powers. But at the end of the day, it is still a pocket universe within the main Marvel universe itself. And that brings us to what I think is the biggest source of confusion when it comes to Franklin and his role in the larger multiverse, which is to say, the ending of Secret Wars 2015. Because at the end of that story, Jonathan Hickman was not overly clear with what was going on. The way that Valeria explained it to us by way of Susan Storm is that basically Molecule Man and Franklin Richards and Reed Richards were working together to restore the multiverse. It's not until you get to Dan Slott's run of the Fantastic Four with issue number 2 where he basically sits down and gives us a far more concrete explanation. And what Molecule Man says is that Franklin has the ability to conceive of a universe, to imagine what a universe should look like, but he doesn't have the power to create one. Instead, he needs the powers of the Molecule Man in order to shape those powers into a universe, which is handed to Reed and then put into the multiverse. So in effect, Molecule Man is creating the clay. The clay is given to Franklin Richards. Franklin shapes it into, I don't know, like a coffee cup. And then Reed Richards takes that coffee cup and puts it on a shelf with all the other coffee cups. So there is a drastic difference between being able to shape an existing piece of clay versus being able to just create the clay of your own accord and then make it look however you want to. Franklin does not have that ability. He cannot create a full-size universe on his own. And so I think it's very important to specify that. And so with all that being said, it is also important to note here, Franklin is equal to Galactus in power, but there are limits to what he's capable of. For example, he cannot face off against multiple Celestials at the same time. In fact, we saw that in Fantastic Four number 604. That's the iconic story where Franklin basically uses the powers of his younger self to resurrect Galactus from the dead. But in the the lead up to that particular moment, the Mad Celestials from an alternate reality looking to destroy Reed and then conquer the main Marvel Universe, Galactus had managed to destroy one. The 3 remaining Mad Celestials merged into a composite being, and they killed Galactus. Reed Richards fires off Saul's anvil, I think is what it was called, and splits the composite Celestial back into 3 Celestials, and then Franklin arrives on the scene. He fights all 3, he destroys one of the Celestials, and in the fight, that's when he uses the power of his younger self to resurrect Galactus. And at that point, it's 2 on 2. Galactus and Franklin versus 2 Mad Celestials, and they successfully destroy them. But in that conflict, one of the things that was stated by Reed Richards' father is that Franklin cannot win against those Mad Celestials on his own. He's simply just not powerful enough. It's just never going to happen. And so that right there kind of gives us a limit to what Franklin Richards can do. That yes, he can manipulate the very fabric of reality itself, but he can only really do what Galactus can do. Now, Galactus has done some pretty impressive stuff. For example, Galactus has left the main Marvel Universe. In Al Ewing's Ultimates, he left the universe and even the multiverse and traveled to the far shore, one of the furthest places of all existence before you get to the realm of the Beyonders, the White Hot Room where the Phoenix resides, and even the House of Ideas where the One Above All resides. Now, we've never seen Franklin travel to the far shore, at least not that I'm aware of, and so there's no reason to believe that he actually can outside of the fact that Galactus could. So anybody who says he can definitively, they're largely just making things up and just assuming he can because Galactus did. But it's not as though Franklin is just someone walking around the universe and is largely only known to the Fantastic Four and Galactus and Celestials or whatever. Franklin Richards is part of the One Above All's plan, which is to say in Immortal Hulk issue number 24, it was established that the intention of the One Above All is that when the universe or even the multiverse comes to an end, that Franklin and Galactus will merge into a composite being and be reborn into whatever happens next. That is, quote unquote, backup is Mr. Immortal. But I think that little tidbit is kind of cool, to be honest with you guys. I mean, it's not overly important, but it's pretty dope to know that the One Above All is well aware of who Franklin Richards is. But the last thing that I want to do here before we bring this video to an end is I want to talk about the nature of Franklin in relation to the Phoenix, and specifically how the Phoenix Force works. We won't make this overly lengthy. If you guys are interested in that video, I can make one just about the Phoenix itself. But something to know here is that in the original Ultimate Universe, for example, that universe's version of Franklin Richards was a host for the Phoenix Force. In fact, we covered that story here on the channel like 7 years ago or something like that. But the Phoenix Force is far beyond Franklin Richards. Even before the retcons of Al Ewing in Ultimates and Defenders Beyond, the Phoenix was always beyond Franklin Richards, because the Phoenix Force exists on a multiversal level. No matter all the universes that exist out there, there's only one real Phoenix Force. Every version of the Phoenix that appears in any alternate reality that exists out there is just a portion of the Phoenix Force's larger power. And that's why fans will tell you that Jean and the Phoenix are not one and the same. A lot of people draw that conclusion because of like the classic X-Men stories, for example, where after the end of the Dark Phoenix saga, when Jean Grey dies, she meets with Mistress Death, and Mistress Death, as a construction worker, basically tells Jean that she's destined to be a host for the Phoenix. She is the Phoenix is her, but Mistress Death also refers to the Phoenix as its own entity. And over the years, other people outside of Jean have been a host for the Phoenix Force. But when Jean has the full totality of the Phoenix Force's powers in the form of the White Phoenix of the Crown, Jean Grey is second only to the One Above All. That was established in Al Ewing's Defenders Beyond when we learned that the White Hot Room is the final stop before you get to the House of Ideas where the One Above All resides. And that when Jean has the White Phoenix of the Crown power, she can create and destroy universes on a whim. There's no limit to the power that she has. Now, oftentimes it just kind of takes the form of quote unquote fixing what's broken, but basically making sure that every universe follows its same form and function. Again, that kind of goes into a more comprehensive explanation about the history of the Phoenix, Marvel taking the Omniversal Development Court role, handing it over to the Phoenix Force, and it kind of being that way ever since, for the last few decades or so. But the fact is, right, this is all simply to say that the Phoenix Force exists outside the multiverse. Franklin Richards just exists on a universal level. So is Franklin Richards powerful? Yes. But if Franklin Richards fought the Phoenix would beat the shit out of him, and it wouldn't even be close. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.